It was hoped that the United States would receive a League of Nations mandate for a new Armenia. Protestant Americans, including President Woodrow Wilson, had heard stories of Muslim oppression brought back by missionaries, and millions of dollars had been raised for Armenians. But any Western-supported Armenia was impossible without access to the Black Sea. For new French Premier Alexandre Mirain, the big issues were financial. The Ottoman Empire still owed France significant sums of money, and with new war debts of its own, France was eager to get its money back and gain extensive controls of Ottoman finances. To Mirain, the Greek presence in Anatolia was a problem. The instability that resulted from the Smyrna landing put Ottoman payments to France in danger, since the city was a major economic center and port now outside of Ottoman control. Eventually, France called for Greek troops to be removed and replaced by an international force. Italy, which by 1920 was abandoning its initial plans for expansion in Asia Minor, agreed. And even though Lloyd George favored the Greeks, many of his countrymen did not. Edwin Montagu, the Secretary of State for India, was worried that if Constantinople was given to the Greeks, Muslims in British India might cause trouble, since the city was still home to the Caliph. Secretary of State for War Winston Churchill and the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Henry Wilson, also felt Greek forces should be removed, as no treaty was possible while they were in Anatolia. But Lloyd George, who was in the Liberal Party, dismissed these concerns on partisan grounds. We must secure Constantinople and the Dardanelles. You cannot do that effectively without crushing the Turkish power. Of course the military are against the Greeks. They always have been. They favor the Turks. The military are confirmed Tories. It is the Tory policy to support the Turks. That is why Henry Wilson, who is a Tory of the most crusted kind, is so much opposed to what we have done. For Venizelos, the whole problem of instability in the region was not because the Greeks were in Anatolia, but because there was no peace treaty. Once the peace was signed, the Turks would become, quote, conscious of their defeat, and the situation would calm down. He advocated for a severe treaty, giving Smyrna to Greece, creating French and Italian mandates, as well as a large Armenian state. If Turkey was not reduced to a small and weak state, he was of the opinion that millions of Christians would be exterminated. But despite his public bravado, in private, Venizelos was pessimistic. He had the support of Lloyd George, but not much more, and he knew it. Henry Wilson recalled a dramatic meeting with Venizelos. I told him straight out that he'd ruined his country and himself by going to Smyrna. And the poor man agreed. But he said the reason was because Paris had not finished off the Turk and had made peace with him. He begged me to tell Lloyd George that both Venizelos and Greece were done. I said I would. The old boy is done. So as the Entente powers debated the treaty amongst themselves and the Greeks waited anxiously for the result, events in Constantinople soon complicated issues even further. Now, since the elections of January 1920, Turkish nationalists had a powerful voice in the Ottoman parliament. The British realized that the assembly would be unlikely to agree to the kind of peace that the Allies were planning. And so they formally occupied Constantinople in March 1920, although informally they'd been there since 1918. Government buildings were occupied and some nationalists were arrested. The Ottoman government could now be relied upon to sign whatever peace treaty that the Allies wanted. The terms of the Treaty of Sèvres were then finalized in April. Britain got most of what it wanted, including the internationalization of the Straits and a guarantee of Armenian and Kurdish states. France and Italy were to gain spheres of influence in Anatolia and, more importantly, strong financial concessions. The Greeks were to gain the region of eastern Thrace, while Smyrna was to be administered by Greece but remain formally a part of Turkey. After 5 years, a referendum was to decide on its final fate. And like the other peace treaties, the Ottomans would pay reparations and had to reduce their armed forces to about 50,000 men and a handful of small boats. No air force was allowed. For Mustafa Kemal and the nationalists, the proposed treaty was political gold. They could now even more strongly frame their struggle as one against foreign occupation. No sooner had the draft proposal become public than reports began to emerge of British outposts coming under attack from nationalist forces. The question of enforcing the treaty now arose in earnest. Marshal Foch estimated that 27 divisions would be needed to defeat the nationalists and impose the treaty, far beyond the forces that the Allies had available in the region. Meanwhile, public opinion in Britain, France, and Italy generally opposed any reinforcement of troops. Venizelos now sensed an opportunity. He hoped that if he promised Greek forces to help defeat Kemal, he could perhaps convince the Allies to grant Greece what it wanted. A clear victory would also relieve political pressure that he was facing at home, to show results from the costly and dangerous Smyrna operation. The British and French now agreed to give the Greeks their chance, and Venizelos seemed to gain renewed confidence in Greek victory. So it was under these fragile circumstances and an impending escalation of the Greco-Turkish War that the Treaty of Sèvres was signed on August 10, 1920, just outside Paris. But even though the Sultan's government had signed it, it was clear to all that the real power in Turkey lay with Kemal, who refused to accept the terms. It would be military force, rather than a peace treaty, which would decide the fate of Asia Minor. Now, the lines of military control in Asia Minor had been more or less stable since the Greek and Allied landings in the first half of 1919. The Greeks remained, for the most part, within the Milne Line, about 100 kilometers around the city of Smyrna. By mid-1920, Greek forces in the Smyrna zone had been reinforced to about 60,000 men, and this force would grow to over 100,000 men by the end of the year. The Greek army was joined by auxiliary and paramilitary units made up of local Greek and Armenian militias. Now, generally, these bands could number as small as 50 men, although the Maori Mari, or Black Fate guerrilla group, numbered about 5,000. The militias fought as light cavalry or engaged in guerrilla war in the countryside against Turkish villagers. The Turkish forces, many of them also irregular militias, operated freely in the Anatolian plateau, and local commanders often decided when and where they would strike. They harassed Greek units, but also attacked Greek and Armenian villages. But Kemal knew that he needed more than militias to win, and he tried in 1920 to absorb these irregular forces into a regular army, which did not always go particularly smoothly, as Turkish writer Halide Edip Adivar explained. The privates of this irregular army received from £15 to £30 a month, which was 3 times as much as what was paid to those of the regular army. And the regulars were badly clad and irregularly paid, besides being under a rigid discipline. Any poor and shabby private could desert his battalion and join the irregulars, where excellent equipment, a good horse, a silver-mounted whip, a belt of shining cartridges, a better and regular pay, as well as an easier life awaited him. Why should anyone be a regular soldier under such conditions? Despite these struggles, by late 1920, the regular Turkish army numbered around 86,000 men, with the conscription of men aged 16 to 60 filling out the ranks. Both the Greek and Turkish forces were armed with a mixture of weapons of different ages and national manufacture. Kemal even claimed to have intercepted 40,000 British Lee-Enfield rifles destined for Armenian and White Russian units. And after the war, he would send Lloyd George a sarcastic letter thanking him for the contribution. Armored cars and aircraft were of limited use on the battlefields of Anatolia, though the 55-plane Greek Air Force was used for reconnaissance.